say energy, you make you back in anarchist. You make you back in
Greetings, boils and ghouls and creepy creatures of the night. I have some terribly distressing news. I'm afraid I might already be dead. You see, I was radicalized during the early 2000s. I suppose it all started with the sham that was the 2000 presidential election. And then it was 9/11 and the racism and jingoism that followed, the passing of the Patriot Act, the Iraq War protests, the hope and change and subsequent letdown that was Obama's election win, the housing market crash followed by the Occupy movement, and all the radical political music that came out during that span of time. But there's just one small problem. I'm told that the radical leftist movement of this era never existed.
The year is 2003. America prepares for war. This was just not an era for political activism through art and music. In 2004, there was an entire double album called Rock Against Bush. Of course, the albums consist mostly of artists that were either no longer relevant or you had never heard of.
Arguably, the pro-war side's music was more emblematic of the times. The only anti-Bush music that got big was a couple System of a Down songs and American Idiot.
Obama was the first politician, this is my first election voting. Obama was the first politician I ever, stand. I don't know, all I had known since the whole time I was a teenager was Bush. And, I fully bought into the idea, this is, hope for this country, he's gonna turn this country around, the war is gonna end.
Radical Reviewer, I saw you Malden and chat over there. Occupy Wall Street, I don't really consider that much of a left-leaning movement. Also, same with the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement and Occupy Wall Street weren't really left-leaning. Occupy Wall Street was more anti-establishment and anti-war, respectively. I don't think those were good vehicles for promoting genuine left-leaning politics.
Then there's also this accelerationist stuff where it's oh, actually we want Trump to be president. We want things to get worse. We want things to be as bad as possible so that the revolution happens.
There is a new far-left fascism.
The argument goes something like this. The left was dead during the Bush years because everyone went super patriotic after 9/11. And the left was dead during the Obama years because we were all apathetic or duped by the hope and change rhetoric. And if the left of this era never existed, then there is only one conclusion. I am already dead. So apparently the Bush years didn't have a strong leftist movement because America was too busy being all...
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
'Cause we'll put a boot in your ass, it's an American way.
We have a man sending us to war for fictitious reasons, whether it's the fictition of duct tape or the fictitious...
Because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away.
But that's not how I remember it. You see, I was a little too young to get into the radical environmentalism or animal rights groups or anti-globalization movement of the late 90s, but I was radicalized right after that. As a young pup, my LGBT plus mother and other adults around me were bemoaning the election of George Bush, because this good old boy's religious fundamentalism spelled disaster for the LGBT plus community. And this piqued my interest in that election, and in politics in general. At the time, I was given the impression that Al Gore, the Democratic nominee opposite George Bush, wasn't anyone's favorite, his greatest quality simply being that he wasn't George Bush. But there was another candidate that folks kept talking about. Ralph Nader. Folks were saying, "Don't blame me, I voted for Nader." Michael Moore was telling folks to vote for Nader. And NoFX was singing, "The president's laughing 'cause he voted for Nader." Ralph Nader was kind of popular with the young pups as well. He was name-dropped in a parody song on Newgrounds called Ultimate Orgy of Homosexuality. For you younger folks, Newgrounds was basically the TikTok, Snapchat, or whatever of ye olden days. And my friends and I would shout, "Vote for Nader" at each other in the halls at school. It was kind of an inside joke. Basically, Nader was popular and kind of hip, and he spoke to people's disaffection with the status quo. Anyway, from this 2000 election, we had Al Gore running harder against Nader than he did against Bush, the shady things that happened to keep Nader out of the debates, Bush's brother promising Bush to win Florida, and then he did. There was electronic voter machine fuckery, and racist voter suppression in the form of a long list of names, a so-called convicted felons list, which was found to be a total scam to suppress the black vote. Then there was the recount being stopped by the Supreme Court and handing the win to Bush. Basically, all kinds of things that you can find in the book The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, and elsewhere. What I'm arguing is that there was widespread anti-corporate, anti-religious right, skeptical of the election, leftist sentiment alive and well in the country. I suppose looking back, Ralph Nader, Al Gore, and George Bush kind of map on to Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. Well, except that Sanders had the benefit of not being third party, something even Nader would later acknowledge, and Bush didn't pander to neo-Nazis and QAnon types and didn't lean hard into xenophobia and nationalism and the pandemic. Well, okay, Trump is kind of uniquely a mess. Maybe Wallace, Humphrey, and Nixon are a more apt comparison? But that's a whole nother story. The lesson is this. Bush was in, people on the left knew that it was a scam, and they were pissed. But then there was 9/11. And maybe a year or so after, where leftist, anti-establishment stuff did kind of die down. But that was not for very long. The left was quickly back at it again. General disdain for the president, the establishment, the Patriot Act, US imperialism, the anti-Iraq war protests, the largest anti-war protests in history happening all over the world. Leftism was back and back strong. Now, not strong enough to demand Medicare for all or a Green New Deal or anything like that, that wasn't really on the table, but strong enough to march the streets demanding an end to jingoism, racism, censorship, and unjust foreign policy. And what about the music scene? Was it really all, "We'll put a boot up your ass, it's the American way"?
We'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way.
Well, Lindsay Ellis and Todd in the Shadows in their videos bring up Madonna, Jewel, the Black Eyed Peas, System of a Down, Perfect Circle, Neil Young, Pink, Green Day, and others, but argue that these mainstream acts were not as explicitly political as the anti-war stuff of the 60s. And the explicitly political projects like Rock Against Bush were full of no longer relevant bands or unknown bands. But
come on, man. Come on, man. Come on, man. Come on, man.
Do you folks really think that Give Peace a Chance is somehow more explicitly political than Boom by System of a Down? Not to mention the accompanying music video which showed the massive anti-Iraq war protests taking place all over the world. I mean, you think the Rock Against Bush albums had a bunch of nobodies on them? Scroll through the list of bands that played Woodstock. I recognize a few names, sure, but I haven't heard of well over half these assholes. Rock Against Bush, on the other paw, was full of great stuff. But really, the most explicitly political music is always on the fringes. Both the little-known bands of the 60s, like Country Joe and the Fish or whatever, and during the Bush years. I mean, look at what came out during that time. NoFX released their album, The War on Errorism. The Briefs had songs like We Americans Are Stupid and Destroy the USA. Choking Victim came out with Hate Your State and War Story. Dead Prez came out with Propaganda. Os Rotten had Right-Wing Warfare and Media Blackout. Leftover Crack with Feed the Children Books of Lies. Mischief Brew came out with the song Against, which is an anti-war song, where he hopes for the day when we will no longer need anti-war songs. And Johnny Hobo and the Freight Trains came out with Election Song, which is about getting blackout wasted because you can't believe that Bush was re-elected. There was just so much damn revolutionary leftist music coming out during that time. But now, I know what you're thinking. But Radical Reviewer, just because the handful of punks at the 4 different high schools you went to were listening to Leftover Crack and NoFX, doesn't exactly make them household names. Yeah, it does. Or maybe not. Fuck, maybe I'm just being silly. But really, let's say that you admit that there was a culture around hating the religious fundamentalism, jingoism, climate change denialism, corporate capitalism and imperialism of the Bush era. Let's say that you admit that there were anti-Iraq war protests all over the world, that people were pissed about the Patriot Act in Guantanamo Bay and the handling of Hurricane Katrina. Let's say that you grant that that proves that there was a leftist presence during the Bush years. Maybe I'm not making it all up. Maybe I just wasn't dead yet. But surely... Okay, so maybe there was an active left during the Bush years, but the left was most certainly dead during the Obama years, right? Chris Hedges said that it was hard to publish articles criticizing America because even lefty publications like Mother Jones wanted to stay positive about all the hope and change stuff. Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize and was being heralded as solving US foreign relations before he'd even done anything yet. After 8 years of Bush, the first black president, and all the hope and change rhetoric, folks were either duped or apathetic. And musically, if you look at timeline graphs like this one for System of a Down, it really seems like the left kinda took a nap for 8 years. But this just isn't the case. I mean, musically you have stuff like Low Key dropping Abomination Part 1 and 2, and Guantanamo School of Medicine released their album Audacity of Hype, which was a joke on Obama's book Audacity of Hope. And there were songs specifically about the market crash and bailouts, like Stimulus Plan by Dead Prez, A Trillion by Rebel Diaz, and Raining Zombies on Wall Street by Big D and the Kids Table. You know what? Maybe more important than the music that was coming out was my personal place in it. Now, Destiny might say,
how musicians used to work like 20, 30 years ago is usually like people pick up instruments, they start playing, they enjoy it, blah, 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 and then they, they form bands and all this stuff would happen, versus today, everything is so much more commercialized.
But that's not really my experience. Now, I know he would admit that there's also an underground music scene. The point I'm trying to make is that I grew up in Cascadia, which, as you know, is a country just south of the west coast of Canada. And during the Obama years, I was going to a liberal arts college, obviously, and I had a driver's license and a job and my own money, and so rather than just being a young pup walking the halls of my high school covered in patches and spikes I'd ordered off of angryyoungandpoor.com or some shit, I started going to shows more regularly. And some of these local venues no longer exist, but most of them still do, and many more have sprung up since. I'm talking the Charleston, Studio 7, Real Art, McCoy's Tavern, Hell's Kitchen, the Kraken, El Corzone, the Funhouse, the Morgue, La Voyeur, Dante's, Mad Hannah, Cafe Racer, and many, many more. The radical left music scene was very much alive and well all through the Obama years. But this is supposed to be about the left in general, so I'll go ahead and drop my personal anecdotes about the punk scene and get to the meat and potatoes, the kibbles and bits of radical leftism from the Obama years. I'm of course talking about the Occupy movement. First, I'm gonna do what the streamers call a Wikipedia Andy, and say that Wikipedia itself says that the Occupy movement is an international, progressive, socio-political movement that expresses opposition to social and economic inequality and the lack of real democracy around the world. It aims primarily to advance social and economic justice and new forms of democracy. Let's dive a little deeper. If we look at the processes of the Occupy movement, that shit was leftist as fuck. Things like occupying public land, free kitchens, free housing, total decentralization, the people's mic, the direct democracy stuff like the twinkles and blocks and the point of interest and all that shit. I mean, damn, the movement was kicked off by adbusters and was full of folks from the anti-globalization movement, for Christ's sakes. And for you data nerds, there was a Gallup poll that came out at the time regarding Occupy, which argued that Democrats are much more likely to say they are supporters, 42%, than opponents, 8%. Most Republicans, 55%, are neither supporters nor opponents, though Republicans are much more likely to oppose the movement, 34%, than support it, 9%. There was also a CBS News article which stated that young and left-leaning Americans were more likely to agree with the movement than were their older and more conservative counterparts. Half of Americans age 18 to 29 say they agree with the movement. Just 1 in 3 Americans age 65 or older say the same. and 2/3 of liberals say they agree with Occupy Wall Street, compared with just 1 in 4 conservatives. But okay, so Occupy was left-leaning. You knew this. But what was said at the Occupy movement? Michael Moore spoke there and exclaimed that public support for gay marriage had passed 50%, to huge applause. Slavoj Žižek spoke there and said that the purpose of the movement was to think about alternatives, to think about what social organization could replace capitalism. Noam Chomsky was there and said that the Occupy movement is based and epic, and everything Radical Reviewer says about it is totally true and valid. Derek Jensen spoke at Occupy and talked about how the Occupy movement was standing hand in hand across time and space with people like John Brown and the IWW. Richard Wolff was there, of course, and did a whole thing promoting democracy at work, which I recently reviewed, by the way, and co-ops and such, and said that the movement was breaking the taboo by questioning the legitimacy of capitalism. Even Bernie Sanders got in on the action and said that the Occupy movement was protesting the proper targets: Wall Street and income inequality. Let's take a look at one of my favorite things from the Occupy movement: the Declaration of the Occupation. Longtime viewers of the show will know that I actually had this stylized version of the Declaration hanging up and visible in some of my first videos, those many, many years ago. Let's have a look at this Declaration of the Occupation. It starts stating, "We come to you at a time when corporations, which place profit over people, self-interest over justice, and oppression over equality, run our governments. We have peaceably assembled here, as is our right, to let these facts be known." And then, like the Declaration of Independence before it, this declaration lists complaints about corporations. Some of which are: they have perpetrated inequality and discrimination in the workplace based on age, the color of one's skin, sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. They have continuously sought to strip employees of the right to negotiate for better pay and safer working conditions. They have held students hostage with tens of thousands of dollars of debt on education, which is itself a human right. They continue to block alternative forms of energy to keep us dependent on oil. They continue to block generic forms of medicine that could save people's lives or provide relief to protect investments that have already turned a substantial profit. They have purposely covered up oil spills, accidents, faulty bookkeeping, and inactive ingredients in the pursuit of profit. And the declaration ends, "We, the New York City General Assembly occupying Wall Street and Liberty Square, urge you to assert your power, exercise your right to peaceably assemble, occupy public space, create a process to address the problems we face, and generate solutions accessible to everyone. To all communities that take action and form groups in the spirit of direct democracy, we offer support, documentation, and all of the resources at our disposal." Beautiful. Great stuff. Based, Pog, Poggers, Base Pog Champ, and all that stuff. If you want to feel nostalgic, or maybe you weren't there when it was happening and you want a kind of rundown of things, well, I made a playlist of Occupy Movement videos. People discussing the processes, the interviews, speeches, people discussing the declaration, and stuff like that. Link in the description. I think the absolute most important thing that the Occupy Movement did was this: the 1%, 99% dichotomy. You see, prior to this, there was always talk about quintiles, the top 20% of earners compared with the bottom 40% of earners, and shit like that. And Occupy said, no, it's not about that. It's not about some delusions of job creators, wealthy class versus some kind of middle class. No, it's about giant multinational corporate conglomerates. It's about the top of society, the 1%. And this changed the narrative in a big way. Let me explain. It's well understood that conservatives will cling to whatever social progress is commonly accepted and say they're fine with that, they just don't want anything more. You know, okay, slavery was bad, we get that. Hell, Lincoln was a Republican. But civil rights? That's just communism. Oh, civil rights are okay? Yeah, that's fine. Martin Luther King was a Republican. Civil rights are cool. But gay rights? No way. That's out of the question. Oh, gay rights are okay? We think so too. Hell, Dave Rubin is a gay. We like the gays. But these trans people, that's too far. And so it goes. And if you followed any of the right-wing populism of recent years, from Donald Dump to Pim Tool to Tucker Carlson Jr., then you've seen that they all have adopted this anti-corporate messaging. They're all, oh yeah, giant corporate 1% economic elites, they're bad. I've always felt that way. But this is a new development. Gone are the government is the problem days of Ronald Reagan, the job creators days of Bush, the corporations are people, my friends, of Mitt Romney. That shit is over. It's dead. They now have to admit, as the rest of us already know, that giant multinational corporate capitalist inequality is a problem. Now, of course, as Republicans, they're totally wrong on solutions and blame everything from coastal elites to celebrities to Freemasons to the globalists and the Jews and stupid stuff like that. But of course they do. But it is progress in a way. It's much easier to convince someone of a solution than having to convince them that the problem even exists. And I think if the Occupy movement was radically left, if radical leftism was alive and well throughout the Obama years, that should fill you with a lot of hope. I mean, I, like many folks, maybe even yourself, saw the rise of Bernie Sanders and RedTube and SRA membership and IWW and SA membership skyrocketing, and I thought to myself, this is a response to Trump. Trump is moving people further left. What will happen when Biden gets in? What will happen to that energy? Will the left go back to sleep? Will it die? But then I remember, wait a minute, radical leftism skyrocketed under Obama. People expected hope and change, and when it didn't happen, they were pissed and took to the streets. And I suspect the same will happen with Biden and Black Lives Matter and stuff. People hearing that Biden is willing or interested to make changes will take to the streets and demand that change. Well, that is, if that was what happened under Obama. If there really was a radical left during those years, and it wasn't just a dream. So what do you think? Was there a radical left during the jingoistic post 9/11 Bush years? Was there radical leftism during the hope and change of the Obama years? Or was leftism dead? Or maybe people saying leftism was dead during that time are just wrong, and I'm right and smart, and they're dumb. Or maybe something in between. Maybe I'm only half dead. I look at it this way. As I argued in my review of The Rise and Repression of Radical Labor, I try and look at leftism as a trajectory. What came before that allowed for new ideas and movements to arise? The slave revolts of Nat Turner and others laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Movement for Black Lives Matter. Shays' Rebellion laid the groundwork for the Radical Labor Movement, and the Radical Labor Movement for the Weather Underground, and the Weather Underground for the labor movement today. The environmentalist movements and the WTO protests of the 90s allowed for the popularity of Ralph Nader. And the popularity of Ralph Nader, backed by the disappointment that was the hope and change of the Obama administration and the demands for change that was the Occupy movement, laid the groundwork for Bernie Sanders and the Squad and the Justice Dems and all that. So, yeah, I guess maybe I'm not dead. Maybe leftism was alive and well and dope as hell all through the 2000s. Did this spooky, I'm dead, radicalism was dead, I have radical in my name metaphor framing device for a Halloween video, did that make sense at all? Who knows? Anyway, don't worry. Leftism will thrive under Biden. And also, don't worry about this silly video. I got more book reviews on the way. I've got a script for ABC of Anarchism by Alexander Berkman and Critique of the Gotha Program by Karl Marx. Both of those are in their final stages. I got reviews of Anarchy Works by Peter Gerdelus and The State and Revolution by Lenin. Those are in their beginning stages. Lots of dope stuff to look forward to, so I hope you like it. Anyway. Happy Halloween!
We got terraform hills and the plastic trees, machines to replace the honeybees. We got oil rigs sticking up out of the sea, working towards the next catastrophe. We got bionic limbs and robotic brains, people homesteading outer space. We've made a lot of progress as a human race, but our lives and our planet is the price we're gonna pay. We got methadone for all the addicts who crave artificial ways of staying sane. Genetically modified fruits and grain, chemicals to treat the cancer we create. We got riot gear and atom bombs. We got our ways to make you talk unaware of how we control your thoughts. We'll get what we want and we're not gonna stop. Future is here and I'm fucking scared. It ain't just and it ain't fair. The consumer society is never gonna care till we can't consume the water and we can't consume the air. And all the rights they take away, and all the ways they subjugate, and how willingly we became their slaves. Oh, no one's gonna care till it's too late.